Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our July webinar on the challenges and complexities of adjuster licensing. My name is Julie Mendel, and I'm the Education Trustee for the SILA Foundation. Before introducing today's speakers, I have a couple of housekeeping items to go over. Our webinar is 1 hour in length, and it is being recorded. We ask that you keep your mics on mute and put any questions you have in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box and posing your questions to the speakers on your behalf. If we do run out of time and you still have questions, we will address them via email after the webinar. Within the next week, you will receive a link to the recording and a post-webinar survey. Today we have two speakers. We will hear from Caitlin Small, the Manager of Regulatory Compliance at Reg Ed. Caitlin has worked in this space for 10 years and is a subject matter expert in licensing registration requirements with a focus on producer, adjuster, reinsurance, intermediary, and agency licensing. And also with us this afternoon is Rachel Chester, who has been with the Rhode Island Insurance Division for over 11 years. She started as a senior insurance analyst and has climbed her way to her current role as Chief of Insurance, Consumer and Licensing Services. Rachel is also the chair of the NAIC Adjuster Licensing Working Group. So please welcome Caitlin Small and Rachel Chester to our virtual stage. Ladies, take it away.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about the challenges and complexities of adjuster licensing, which, if you are familiar with adjusters, is a very common problem in this space. But before we do get started, I do want to just kind of do a high-level overview of adjuster licensing. I know most of you that are attending this are probably well-versed in the background of adjuster licensing issues, but I do just kind of want to give a crash course of adjusters for those that might not know a lot of this so that they can kind of follow along as we get through the rest of the presentation. So what is an adjuster? The NAIC licensing handbook explains that an adjuster is a person who investigates claims, determines coverage, examines documents, as well as determining the amount of claim, loss, or damage payable under an insurance contract or plan. So that's going to be different than your insurance producer who's going to be selling the policy. You have an adjuster who's going to be handling the claim underneath that policy. And within that, you're going to have several different adjuster license types. Your independent and your staff/company adjusters are going to be the ones that we're mainly going to kind of focus on today, and as well as the ones that you're going to kind of find in the information and SILA resources. That your independent adjusters are going to be the individuals who are self-employed or associated with an independent adjusting firm that are hired to adjust losses on behalf of an insurance company, which is different than a staff or company adjuster, which is somebody who is a direct salary employee of an insurance company. Your public adjusters are we're not going to really talk about them in detail here, but they are worth mentioning because it is something you're going to see kind of through the licensing process as an option, that your public adjusters are individuals who are usually hired by the insured. And then you have your emergency CAT adjusters, which are a little bit different. They're people who are otherwise qualified to adjust claims, but aren't licensed in the state where the catastrophe has been declared. There's usually an emergency declaration that takes place, after a tornado, that it's kind of an all hands on deck situation that states kind of amend the requirements to be able to handle claims under that declaration. So it makes it a little bit, I don't want to say easier than obtaining the license, but the requirements are a little less rigorous to obtain that. So if you're an independent or staff adjuster, it's kind of what is offered to me to apply for. And this map on the right-hand side here kind of shows you a high level of the requirements based on the state. Your purple states are going to be the ones that offer the independent adjuster license. And the yellow states offer a staff or independent adjuster license. And as you can see, depending on what kind of adjuster you are, it's going to kind of vary which states offer you a license. And even within your yellow states, there's a little bit of different uniformity there. You have some states like Texas that offer just one adjuster license, and that encompasses both your staff and independent adjuster. And then you have states like New Mexico or Kentucky that are going to offer you two different licenses. You have your independent specific license you apply for, or a staff. So it's something kind of to be mindful of when working through the license application to make sure you're selecting, the right adjuster license, because I think we can all agree that nobody likes to have to accidentally apply for the wrong thing, because then it delays the whole license process and makes it a little bit of a headache to fix that. And then you have your white states that are going to be the states that don't offer a staff or independent adjuster license. So then the question kind of becomes, well, what happens if I'm a resident of Colorado and I need to handle claims in Texas or Arizona? What do I do? How do I get that license if I can't even get one in my resident state? So that brings us to the designated home state, or DHS. The definition is up there on the screen there, but basically what it is it was created to fix that problem. It's eligible for individuals who reside in those non-licensing states to be able to designate another licensing state as their home state. Kind of works similar to a resident license, but it's going to report and look a little different, but there's usually an exam requirement, usually a CE requirement, some kind of background check that basically says that you've qualified for this license to use it as a home state. And that way you're able to kind of obtain other licenses based off of that. And then Rachel, is there anything you wanted to add kind of on what you see on your side for on the state?
Sure. So we do handle a lot of designated home state applications in our state, just like many other states. And the designated home state process has grown since it became a thing. The regulators are all trying to report the information the same way to the PDB. We're trying to make reliable information available so that as you work your way through the application, you can, ensure that you're applying for the right thing. And an important nuance about designated home state is that individuals should be keenly aware of what their designated home state is at the time of application. You might be surprised that there are a lot of people that don't know, but there are a lot of people that don't know. So keeping track, if you're responsible for keeping track of a whole team, then you should have it documented someplace where they earned their designated home state. So as you apply to other jurisdictions, you can be consistent in how you deliver that information on an application. So that brings me to a little bit of the challenges, right? So some of the challenges is the designated home state that someone selected in an application, can we verify that? Is it a reciprocal DHS status in every state? I will just say that in Rhode Island, we do not have a continuing education component for our adjusters. So we know that there are states that will not reciprocate with a designated home state of Rhode Island. And I've been trying to get CE for adjusters for a while. We will eventually get there, and then we won't have that disclaimer that Rhode Island's not a good DHS state anymore. Although I think it's pretty good regionally. I'll just say that. So some challenges, you can certainly see them up on the screen, but reciprocity is a challenge. I'll just throw Rhode Island under the bus again. We do not have fingerprinting. That's a statutory authority that we just don't have. So that, again, makes us kind of a bad state to choose for DHS, but you can still get a DHS and come get a license from us because we will reciprocate with it. But it's not a plug for Rhode Island. I'm just trying to explain some of the challenges. You've got states like Wyoming and Oklahoma that only accept certain DHSs, and then you've got some states that don't recognize designated home state statuses. The exam requirement, some states will waive the exam if you have a certain certificate from an approved certification provider. I don't want to say any of the names of who they are because I'm not sure I'm supposed to do that, but they're out there. It's right there. It's right there. I can say it. Designated certification accepted. So you can see I'm not actually reading the slides. And then we have the continuing education prong that maybe shouldn't vary, but it does. And there's some special categories. Can you think of a couple of special categories, Caitlin? There's it's usually
flood, ethics, and law, and earthquake as well.
Right. So the challenge of tracking that, reporting it, making sure people are compliant in those states that are compliant, that have those requirements. Those are all like real life challenges. I learned a statistic earlier this year at a different conference. It was at the Reg Ed conference that there are over 300,000 compliance items in our world of licensing here. So it's a constant evolution of how do we make this better?
Yeah, and I mean it is true. It's designated home state. You know, it's been great. I know that this is something that kind of came about. You know, probably within the last 10 or 15 years that, you know, it has made things a lot easier. I can kind of remember a time before, you know, when a lot of states didn't really report a certain way, that it was very challenging to try and figure out, you know, what is your DHS, right? And it is kind of something to keep in mind when you are looking at you know, getting licensed as an adjuster or licensing your staff, like what DHS is the best fit. And there's not really a right or wrong answer to that, just kind of based on what their need is. But things that, you know, like you said, to keep in mind is, you know, if you have to handle claims in Wyoming or Oklahoma, they have a specific list that, you know, they reciprocate with, and, you know, you just need to double check that before you pick one if you have a need in those states. You know, and being mindful of continuing education. I know Rhode Island, you guys don't have it, so I don't want to pick on you, but I know that it's many times where people are like, I'm gonna, you know, pick a DHS that doesn't have CE, and I'm never gonna have to do CE, and that's not really the case. It sometimes can make things a little bit harder in the long run. You know, that here on the screen, you can kind of see that the applications are going to be asking non-uniform questions about, you know, where did you qualify for the exam? Where did you take the exam? What did it cover? And where are you doing your CE? A lot of states, even if it's, you know, your non-resident state, they track that information. They want to know. So it's, even if you have a, you know, a home state that doesn't have CE, it's picking a state where you are doing that on, you know, your biannual basis, and making sure you're reporting that information accurately to the to your other non-resident states. And speaking of reporting,
Right. So I will say that one of the charges of the NAIC Adjuster Licensing Working Group is how do we get comfortable with our data integrity? What are we sending as regulators? What are we sending to the PDB that people are relying on? And we've been talking. We haven't had a lot of meeting this year. I'm just going to be honest. It's been a kind of at capacity year. But there's been a lot of sidebar discussions on how we can get how we can make changes about better reporting. Are there other ways that we can validate this information? So the discussions are happening, and I think a lot of the discussions are really happening regionally. I speak, you know, in the Northeast zone region. I have the occasion to reach out to the licensing directors in other states, and we try to keep that line of communication open, because I'll just say Connecticut, because they're a state that touches us, and they license both company and independent adjusters. We'll go back and forth with each other to try to solve a problem across state lines for a licensee. So the regulators are, I believe that we are all trying to work to make this a little bit you know, easier. We don't want to get bogged down with requests that take us away from other work just because something doesn't look right. So any opportunity that we can to consider how is this information reliable, and does it make sense? What we're looking at is a fake licensee, unless there's a licensee out there with the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I really don't know. This is just a fictitious.
I hope not. I tried to keep it ambiguous here.
This is a fictitious thing. And what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that this person has a Texas designated home state adjuster license, because Texas is reporting that Texas gave this person designated home state status. Now, John Doe wants to also have a license in North Carolina, and John Doe's application comes through with Texas as the designated home state selection. So we can very easily see that this person has provided accurate information to the state of North Carolina, because the state of Texas is reporting themselves as the designated home state for this individual. Now, there is the nuance of lines of authority. We didn't talk about that a whole lot. There are some situations where folks will have a DHS just for a line of authority. I think I've not seen them, but I do believe that they're out there. And those situations do make sense, but it still complicates the ease of flow through the electronic application process. So knowing who those, like what those situations are ahead of time will make the application process better, and the application to all the other states when you're telling them that your state is Texas, as in this example. So there's a couple of things on on here. There are some states that cannot update the field for DHS once a license is approved. Hopefully we're working on solving that type of problem. States do use this PDP report to what it says here, to flag a CE state, and that just for a state that requires CE, they're going to say, okay, does this person have a CE state? Yep, I can find it. I can see that they are compliant if that information is reported. It doesn't look like that's reported on the example we have. Caitlin, do you know if there are situations where the CE compliance is like a yes or a no?
I haven't seen it from the CE field side. No, I know that, if you're using, if you're doing your hours in Arkansas, and that's kind of what they've flagged you as a DHS because you're doing CE there, your SBS transcript will report that information there, but it won't, I don't believe that CE compliance field there on the PDB updates.
And I do know that at least in the SBS states, which is Rhode Island is an SBS state, so I can talk about what I know about that. I know that they're a while ago, I was like, oh my God, all the states are so mad. They've got to do extra work because Rhode Island's not a CE state. And Oklahoma assured me, don't worry, Rachel, we talked to SBS, we figured it out. We just make them do our CE and it uploads. So I was like, phew, we solved that problem. Well, I didn't solve it, but somebody else solved it. And then there are rare situations, but there are a few situations where states don't actually utilize the DHS field. And this is the perfect example because Texas is not going to also report itself in the DHS field with a TX. I don't think that they do, but they make their license so that you can see that it's a Texas issue designated home state. So the eyeballs can still verify the information that the applicant has provided.
Right. And it's just kind of being, mindful of both of these fields, the license class or that DHS field. So if the individual on the bottom there with North Carolina, if they were using North Carolina, that field in the red box would reflect the NC. Because there are some states that don't have it in the license class. It'll, North Carolina will report itself as the DHS there. Because I think, I know I've seen some PDBs where it's you pull it and it's reflecting a bunch of different states, and that's I think what we're all trying to avoid, right? We want to make sure that the data is streamlined, and whether or not some of that is just from erroneously picking your DHS when you're starting an application, that can update that field, and then then the state can get confused on why you have a different home state. They might even reject the application if you accidentally pick a different DHS than what they have on file. And then, then you're potentially dealing with a missed renewal, and nobody ever wants to have to deal with that. So it's just kind of, keeping mind of what you're selecting when you are applying or renewing, and making sure that the states kind of have that information and are updated timely whenever that information does change. Yeah.
Reciprocity challenges. Caitlin, I will let you start this one.
Yeah, I know. It's when I was asked about doing the adjuster webinar, it's like, oh man, I gotta pare this information down to try to keep it within an hour. It's I feel like with the reciprocity challenges, you could talk all day, and sometimes I feel like we do, and that sometimes we're running in circles. But adjusters kind of lend themselves to having a lot of reciprocity issues just because there's more challenges, with the states not licensing and the way the laws are written. It's just vastly different than the producer world, but it makes things a lot more interesting. I don't want to call out California, New York, and Hawaii, but it's no secret that those are the three that have the, I don't want to say retaliatory, but they have the exam requirement for your resident and non-resident applicants. And that poses challenges on both sides. If you're a New York resident that's trying to apply for licenses in other states make you take their exam because you make their residents take the exam. So that is a little bit hard, that these, if you are a resident in those three states, it's a little bit more of an uphill battle than somebody who lives in Texas or has a DHS in Texas. That's a little bit more of a straightforward path. And I know that California has tried to amend that. It's usually not for lack of trying. It's just, there's a lot of kind of red tape to jump through when making some changes, especially big changes like that it is, we're just kind of dealing with it the best that we can as well. And then there's DHS reciprocity as well. We talked about on the other slide that, if you have a DHS and you want to be licensed in Arizona or Alaska, that is going to be two states that are going to require you to test. They don't have that requirement for people who have resident licenses, but it is a DHS requirement. So there is some kind of exam reciprocity issues there, just from a DHS perspective. And when I was kind of looking at information for doing this presentation, it just kind of reminded me that, it seems like we sometimes harp on the fact that we don't make a lot of progress, but New Mexico didn't have a state exam requirement until 2017. So it's kind of like, that seems like it wasn't like that long ago in the grand scheme of things, but for a very long time, you had New Mexico residents that were trying to obtain licenses in other states. And there's that question that says, where did you take a state exam? And they might not have taken, they couldn't take one in New Mexico. They had to take one somewhere else. So, in terms of reciprocity, that was a huge kind of victory for New Mexico. I don't know if the individual adjusters that had to now take the exam thought that, because these exams are hard, but just in terms of being able to obtain licenses in other states, it definitely was a win in that regard. And then, you're
Caitlin,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I've got to talk about the exam question for just 1 second. So why would we ask where you took an exam? I believe that came from perhaps people applying with the DHS that wasn't their DHS. It had been accepted for a while. At the beginning of DHS licensing, it was on the applicant, like, well, you're telling us that that's your designated home state. All right, we're done. So we've grown over the last 10, 15 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that, and sort of tweaked, like, how we don't want people getting through an application if they, for the most part, if they can't get through the application, or if they shouldn't qualify for a license. So adding that additional question of, well, where did you take an exam? Really just it helps the regulators know that you do actually qualify for a license. We don't ask that question in Rhode Island. And I think when we tried to ask the question, it got very confusing for people. What do you mean? Where did I take my exam? So I'll just go back to the first comment I said, which people should be keenly aware of what state they asked to be their home state. So we will get there. We continue to get better and better and better. And we don't want to keep asking more and more questions. But what we want to do is issue licenses the right way.
Right. Yes. No, that's definitely a good point. And that does bring into question, the exam versus your designation. I know that trips up a lot of people too, because if they obtain their home state license with a certification or designation, it's, well, I didn't take a state exam. I got a different designation to qualify for this. And those are the 3 or the 4 that I have listed up there are kind of the most commonly accepted ones within the states. And I did want to mention that I know the UCC is kind of handled a little bit differently, that Arizona and Florida require the proof of pre-licensing and exam requirements. So that is something, if you have that or looking to obtain that I guess there is some kind of caveat there that if you are licensed in another state, you don't have to take that portion of it. That, even if you are seeking that, it's possible that other states you're applying for are going to be wanting to see that proof of pre-licensing and exam, that they won't just take the certificate. They want to see how you actually qualified for that. And then the other challenges with exams are going to be, we're going to talk about this later in a couple of slides about transferring licenses. There's a lot more kind of issues when you're moving from one state to another, that even if you can't just get a letter of clearance or go off your previous resident state, you might still just need to retest for the license. And then obtaining a DHS with an exam completed in another state. This is probably a little bit more uncommon, but I see it frequently enough that it does cause some challenges. That, it's more kind of a situation of somebody who's, because you look at that and you're like, well, how could you get a DHS without testing there? But it's more of a situation of somebody who, say, lived in Florida and then moved to Texas and got a resident license there, and then moved to Colorado and converted that to a DHS. Then, you never took the Texas exam, but you took the Florida exam. So it's kind of like a little bit more of a unique situation, but that does kind of call into question, well, how did this state give you a DHS if you never tested there? And, that can just kind of come with an explanation, but it is something that's, does happen to people. People do move. But it's, the technology, sometimes the question asks that, and then it just automatically kicks it out if your DHS doesn't match. So sometimes it is kind of having to work with the state and explain and say, no, like this is the situation, and this is why it's this way. And then lines of authority. Your most common lines of authority with adjusters are going to be your property casualty, workers' comp, and crop. I know crop's kind of its own own little niche there that you do see that offered in most, if not all states. But property casualty, workers' comp are going to be your main three. And like most things in adjuster licensing, there's a non-uniform approach to this. Some states call it all lines. Some it just says none. Some the workers' comp lines included under PC. And then you have the limited lines of authority that I've kind of highlighted there, that those can be challenging. If you have somebody who only holds motor vehicle in their resident state, and now they need to obtain licenses in non-resident states, it really kind of becomes tricky of, well, I hold this limited license, what can I obtain? Am I eligible to obtain? And that can kind of really turn into just having to reach out to the states and say, is this person eligible? And some of them say, yes, we'll give them, a P&C line, and some say no, because they don't want the risk of an individual possibly handling claims they might not be qualified for. So I know that's a bit of a challenge when you have individuals that have a limited kind of scope of the claims that they handle.
Also,
and then there's also the rest.
It's also challenging for the regulators, Caitlin. So
yes, I think we share
challenging.
the same kind of frustration there.
Right, and I will just note that the most common lines of authority are part of the independent adjuster guidelines. Those are the four, uniformly accepted lines of authority. But we do sort of have all these non-uniform lines of authority, and it's not in every state. I feel like there's a good majority of states that
Yes.
have just the property casualty, workers' compensation, and crop. And if you want to talk about how to mess up electronic efficiencies, here it is, like lining up a line of authority that's in the left column of the screen that I'm looking at to the non-uniform column is very difficult. That matrix certainly seems impossible to create. I will definitely admit that. So it is. SILA has a lot of good resources. Some of us on this that are here have worked on some SILA adjuster charts to make sure that those pieces of information are accurate and reliable. I still use a lot of those charts, and I do still use some charts that other regulators in other states have created. So we do share the information that we have with each other. But the reciprocity issues are obvious, because I don't know what some of the lines of authority on a New York adjuster's license qualifies them for. So should I? And I'm just saying New York because we get a lot of New York based on our region. But so do I trust that the applicant is applying for the thing that equals what they have in their home state? We got to get comfortable, even as regulators to regulators, understanding what these different lines of authority are and the limitations, to make sure that we're not giving more authority, even though our statute, just like everybody else, says that you're only going to get the same authority you hold in your state. There's probably not a huge appetite for what I think is an amazing solution, which is a line of authority in a non-resident record that says, limited to your home state. But our market conduct folks would they disagree, because they want, and rightfully so, because they want to know who's selling what, and they don't want to have to go down well, where did they start? What do they have there? What does that mean, etc. So it is a complicated situation, but for the most part, it works pretty well.
Yeah, and I mean, and it kind of can become a little bit of a puzzle at times like that. And it is kind of, from the state side, I definitely understand that it's, you don't want to issue a license to somebody who might not be qualified, because if they're handling claims, that want to protect the people of your state, to make sure that the people that are doing business or handling claims are qualified to do it. And that's where it kind of really gets into the weeds a bit, where it's, especially with that workers' comp line of authority is a challenge that, some states it's included under casualty, but, you in Rhode Island might not see it that way, that, if you have a workers' comp offering in that state, that's what you're going to reciprocate with. But even if, that home state might have it listed under there, that PC is considered all lines. So it is kind of an interesting, way to navigate this, that, the workers' comp piece is in and of itself a bit of a challenge, but kind of defining what all lines means or what property casualty means makes things a little bit clearer in the process.
And one final hiccup in this this workers' comp, since you're talking about workers' comp, I know you love the workers' comp conversation, Caitlin.
I can talk about workers' comp problems all day.
there are not every insurance department handles workers' comp,
Yes.
like licensing or registration compliance. We do here in Rhode Island, but what we have a separate thing in Rhode Island by our Department of Labor and Training that has workers' comp TPAs getting registered somehow. So I didn't even know that until a couple of years ago when somebody asked me, and I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. So I had to make some new friends over at the other agency on the other side of the complex. So it is very important to get as much information for the states that you need to be licensed in, or you're handling the licenses for, so that you don't miss a nuance. And I think we tried to do a pretty good job on that workers' comp spreadsheet that we have, where the SILA resource, where we did a little bit more digging to find these other sort of veins in state agencies that would touch workers' comp compliance items. That's all I wanted to say about that.
And that's kind of, a good segue into the continuing education. You talk about that there are some, states that have different requirements for workers' comp, which is also true on the CE side here. Some states, if you're licensed for workers' comp, are going to have a DOL or Division of Labor requirement that's specific for that. But as you can see on the right-hand side, your blue states are going to be your states that require CE, your yellow states do not. And Vermont's one that I was having a bit of trouble trying to figure out how to code them on here, because their PC adjusters don't have a CE requirement, but there is for their workers' comp adjusters a workers' comp specific requirement. I believe it's like a seminar they have to do in order to renew that license. So it was important to kind of make that delineation here on that map, that it's a little bit different, but also highlights that every state handles CE differently, and even down to the line of authority, it can vary a lot. And like we said with Rhode Island, that you guys don't have CE, so you might have to complete multiple state CE requirements, or pick a state where you're doing it in and then reporting it to everybody else. And that can be a challenge. There are varying hours, the ethics, flood, earthquake, and law. But it is worth mentioning, I know Oklahoma's I don't want to say getting rid of it, but the earthquake requirement for property line adjusters is no longer going to be required after September. So that will be one less kind of nuance to navigate in the CE space. But CE is one of those things that it's not, I know it's not easy for states to get this added. Rachel, I think you've said you've tried in Rhode Island to get a CE requirement for several years. I know, you can see Washington added it recently in 22. I think Jeff said that he tried for 9 years to try to get something on the books for it, that it's not for lack of effort. It's just CE, I think, is one of those things that really is hard to get a change through for. And New York kind of is one of those examples of that every year they introduce some bill to add a CE requirement, and unfortunately it just seems to never go anywhere. But it's not for lack of trying. They introduce it every year, so there is some kind of they must recognize we need to be doing this, but it's just getting it passed is it's a victory enough to kind of get it to the floor to move its way through the process, but getting it approved can sometimes be very difficult as well.
Real life challenges, Caitlin.
Yes. All right, and I'm going to turn this over to you for because your state's up here, so I'll let you do some of the talking on this one.
This is the call out slide. So
this is the one everyone knows about.
So 3 states have recently changed how they do things. We're all familiar with Mexico and Wyoming. Actually, you might not be familiar, because there might be some people here that don't have any idea. So I want to kind of, and Rhode Island is on here. I want to talk about why the changes were made and like the timeline for compliance, at least in the Rhode Island situation. We're all faced with the challenge of making sure we efficiently license people. Speed to market is important. We of course want to make sure people get licenses so that the citizens in our state can be, have the services that they need. This is true for producer for any license, and for adjuster licensing. And we are one of the 14 states that also require company and staff adjusters to be licensed. And part of the problem is that if somebody lives in a resident if they're a resident of a state where they can get an independent adjuster license, but they're a company or a staff adjuster license, that totally changes the way, at least I'll speak for New Mexico, Wyoming, and Rhode Island, receive and handle an application. So I've been personally intimately involved with the changes we've made historically in Rhode Island, because I was looking at 100 paper applications a day. And I'm like, why are we getting paper applications? I don't understand. Well, because we have the nuance of the independent and the company adjuster, and the platform is built on looking for a resident license. And if it can't find a resident license, then all of the states sort of handle that. They have their own business rules on whether it pens electronically, whether it stops it completely, whatever. So we've made some changes, and in Rhode Island, we definitely agreed with the changes that New Mexico and Wyoming were making, because the ease of applying for a resident license is it's just easier. It's just easier. And I make the argument that a company adjuster could get an independent adjuster license in their resident state, and instead, for fine reasons, goes out to another state that requires both independent and company, and takes they're getting tested on the same concepts. It's the same knowledge that they're getting from the state that from the test that they could take in their resident state but don't have to, but they go out and find another state. So that's fine. It muddies the process of efficient licensing in general. So we believe in Rhode Island that it would be way easier to issue licenses if that resident flag was yes, and we could just, like, everybody reciprocates except for the 3 that you already called out with Hawaii, California, and New York. No one's not reciprocating with a resident license. So even though Rhode Island doesn't have CE, even for our resident adjusters, I'm not aware of any state that says, nope, we don't reciprocate with Rhode Island. But somebody's going to go out and choose Rhode Island as a DHS state, and then they're not going to be reciprocated with Rhode Island, because you've got a choice to go pick, a DHS that's going to be reciprocal in every state. So the genesis of this is how do we run our shops and license people as effectively and efficiently as possible. In the case of Rhode Island, we're going to get to that same place that New Mexico and Wyoming is. We just put the tail a little bit longer. I issued a bulletin this year. That's why you put me on the slide. I know. Issued a bulletin this year that says that we're going to enforce this compliance by December 31st, 2028. That's like a five-year timeline, and it's not to complicate anyone's situation. It is to make it so that people can more easily apply for a license. And then it kind of inherently takes away the DHS shopping concept, which I don't know happens as much as it used to happen before, because if you're going to shop for a DHS and you realize it's not a good one, now you got to go find another one. It's not in the licensee's best interest to shop for a DHS no longer. So this is we want you can get it in your own state. We want you to get it in your own state, and then we're going to be super efficient at licensing you, instead of manually working through a process. And then it gets it onto the application platform and can be renewed thereafter. So good segue into the next slide, which is industry versus state challenges. I kind of do want to read all of these things because I don't like reading the slides, but all of these things are at the top of my head. I'm going to read it so I don't go off on a tangent, because we only have so much time. So on the industry side of the house, perhaps a reduction in states that are serviced. They're going to surrender the Rhode Island and Wyoming, New Mexico licenses. I will always say that if people are going to be surrendering licenses in droves in Rhode Island, I'd like to know, because I just want to make sure that there's not a disruption in the availability of adjusters to handle the citizens of Rhode Island that expect to have, speedy service from their insurance company. So we're not trying to stop that from happening. Industry's got the challenge of converting DHSs to resident licenses. And what does that really mean? That means that if Rachel Chester currently has a designated home state, but I live in a state where I could get a license, then I'm giving up my DHS status and I'm getting licensed in my resident state. The challenges with that are, well, now do you need an exam to convert? Is your resident state going to be annoyed that you haven't had a license in their state, even though you could have? I don't know. There might be situations where a state might make you take an exam because you've lived there and now you want to get a license, but you didn't take an exam or get licensed in the state to begin with. There are 34
And that's,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and I was going to say, and that's kind of, I see that too, that it's, individuals, they kind of move in between, employers. That's common in this space, that, you might have worked for a carrier and now you're working for an adjusting firm. And, I see that where it's, somebody's been living in Michigan for 5 or 6 years but they have Florida DHS because Michigan's doesn't license staff adjusters. So it is kind of one of those things that it's like, it takes, I kind of see the questioning of it where, I think that's part of the mindset that you were talking about of if everyone just gets licensed in the resident state, you're not going to have to think about that. That it's okay, well, why didn't this person get the license there? Is it because of who they worked for, or is it because they just didn't want to get licensed in Michigan? And in most cases they didn't get it because that wasn't the requirement at the time. They don't have to have the license there, but it kind of makes navigating it a little bit more of a challenge from that space. And this whole independent staff thing has been kind of interesting to watch, because as a third party, it's, I assist with independent adjusters and staff adjusters, and I've talked to a lot of state regulators, and I don't think anybody has like a wrong opinion or feelings about this, because I think there's challenges from every aspect. Like you said, the surrendering of the licenses is, that's some carriers are like, we don't want to have to worry about this. We're just going to just surrender those people that have those licenses. Or, converting from a DHS to a resident, it's making people having to take more tests. And from the independent side, it's a lot more states, and they're usually the ones that have the problems. It's the exam required, the non-reciprocal, the missing CE. So, you're going from a much smaller footprint to having to manage all of these requirements that you haven't had to jump through before. It really can, pose some issues and logistical headache. Like I have up there the New York resident versus Texas DHS. Texas is considered what the gold standard of reciprocity there from exam and CE, that it's, all right, well, now you have a New York resident license and you're going to have to test to possibly maintain your licenses. And now you got to figure out what you're doing CE. So it's kind of the trickle down of this change that I know that has been a lot of challenges with it from the industry side.
And I'm sensitive to the fact that I'm one of the 16 states there in Rhode Island that do require both the company and independent. And I'm super sensitive to the fact that now industry has to think about 34 state requirements instead of just 16 state requirements. I've done a lot of talking about this for a while, and I've talked to a lot of carriers. And, at the end of the day, we just want to get to a place where we can license as quickly as possible and with the most current, up-to-date information. I can speak candidly about the state challenges. Some states are receiving pressure to make a statement that they prohibit a staff adjuster from obtaining an independent adjuster license. It's allow versus prohibit.
The importance of language is very important there. It's, will you allow it versus will you prohibit it? That's usually the very difference there is we'll allow it, but they don't require it. It's very tricky with that language.
It is quite tricky. And then individuals hired by adjusting firms when they previously worked for carriers. I know firsthand, in Rhode Island, we went from 1 claim adjuster license to 3 licenses. We went to a public adjuster, a company license, and an independent license. The number of people who chose the wrong license and then said, hey, I chose the wrong one, I need you to fix it. But we were doing a ton of changes. So after like 6 months of craziness, we squished it to company and independent. So that's just 2, a public adjuster, which nobody here really cares about, but a company / independent adjuster, because people, not only do they choose the wrong one by accident, but they also stop working for an insurance company and start working for an independent adjuster firm. Now do they have to cancel, reapply, pay another fee, have a new license? Like, now. So we squished it all together to make it easier because we broke it to begin with. But yeah. So 3:45. I think we should go to the next slide. I'm not going to read that last.
Yeah, we can definitely. I know we're trying to keep on time on the pacing here. The next thing that has come up recently, I know on the adjuster advanced course that Rachel, I know you have assisted with as well, that in kind of this remote working environment, you have a lot of people that are moving, and that can really pose a lot of challenges in trying to navigate that. I've been able to help with producer moves, and that can sometimes just be so easy. It's 2 address change forms and then it's switched and it's done. And I wish that for adjuster relocations, but that's not always the case. If you have an individual who's moving to a resident license, there's things to kind of consider and a lot more moving parts than if you're assisting a producer that's moving, as well as to a DHS. Is their DHS accepted by all non-resident licenses held? If you have a Rhode Island resident that's moving to Massachusetts and they say, I want to keep Rhode Island as my DHS, they can certainly do that. But if they, have Oklahoma or Wyoming, there's going to be an impact to those licenses. If they have Arizona or Alaska, exams are going to be required to keep those because they don't recognize a DHS, but the exam is going to be required. And then just some things to kind of be mindful of after the conversion takes place, that it's still a lot of moving parts. The address changes, notifying non-resident states a DHS has changed. I think some of that stuff gets kind of lost in the shuffle of trying to file all of this stuff, that, you don't want your non-resident states thinking you have a DHS in Texas when now you're a Florida resident. That it's kind of making sure that states are updated with that information and keeping that, we talk about data integrity, streamlined so that everyone's on the same page, so that when renewal times comes, there's no question of, well, you never told us you moved. That it's kind of making sure that everyone's on the same page with that. And then also, amending licenses if lines of authority aren't held. If you're moving to a state that doesn't hold a line of authority, that can be a bit of a challenge to navigate, that your non-resident states might not want you to keep it. So just some things to kind of keep in consideration as you're assisting in individuals that are moving, that it's, I kind of liken adjuster licensing almost to like an onion, because it's got so many layers. You gotta, at first glance, it looks like it's going to be, easy. And then as you peel back those layers, it kind of gets a little bit more complicated and more things to consider as you kind of move through it.
I like the onion. I'm just going to say that because, then you start crying because it's too complicated.
Yes. Some days it might feel like that, where it's, it makes you almost want to cry sometimes when you're going through it. Because it's like, why does it have to be so hard? It doesn't have to be this hard. But, that's why, we try to participate in as many of these kind of webinars and conversations to keep that line of communication open. Right. So do you want to talk about kind of some of the NAIC stuff that you guys are working on?
I will do my best, and I will not cry. The onion is big. We're talking like Vidalia onion. So the adjuster working group focus, that it's up there. I don't assume that everybody can read it, so I'll read it. I can see it. So maybe some people are calling in, so I will read it. It says seeking guidance. I did actually already seek the guidance. I'm working on some homework, seeking guidance from the NAIC on requirements to explore the feasibility of moving the independent adjuster guidelines to a model act. Since the typing of that bullet point, it has been sought, but also there's some other traction in the NCOIL space with a model act that is called Public Adjuster Model Act, but has a lot of licensing stuff in it about independent and staff adjusters. So there is some traction in a couple of different veins on how do we force people to get to a happier place. I don't know that forcing is the right way. Potential regulator reciprocity, common ground agreement. That's not to be thought of as an 18-page document, more of a practical, how can we get to a place where we all agree about like 5 things that affect the ease of licensing, not does that line of authority equal that other line of authority, which is in the middle of the onion. Data integrity, verifiable and reliable PDB reporting. So we talk on a regular basis with each other because we've got to verify each other's information that we're reporting to the database. And then uniformity at its very basic level, right? So just it works in the producer world. It has not worked in the adjuster world, but let's try. We will continue to try to push that ease of licensing and less complicated lines of authority and license types. Adding license types also complicates things. So I don't know that I have a whole lot more to offer on this particular update.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's a good point too, is that, when we talk about uniformity and, we all, if we could just wave a magic wand and things would just be fixed, we would do that. But, it's kind of like with the whole, lines of authority or license type, that it's, what changes can be made without having to kind of jump through these big hoops to make the change, that even if it's just the smallest of change and, getting everyone on the same page with how the PDB reports the data, or, getting lines of authority, defining what some of that stuff is. And even small changes like that, I think will make a big difference in this space, kind of work with what we can and make changes where we can. I know that we kind of all wait for some of those big bills to come through. But it's any small effort makes a big difference. And so that's kind of a good question into, what does the future of adjuster licensing look like? And I wish I had an answer to this question. I think, the future of adjuster licensing, it's ever changing. If I could get into, DeLorean and go like 30 years in the future and see like maybe everyone will be reciprocal and we'll all be able to, hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But it's, I think it is important that we also recognize that even though we kind of talk about some of the same issues, we always talk about exams or CE, that there have been changes and not all of them are, met with anger or frustration. That, there are changes that happen for the good. And I think that's a testament to that. It's working kind of in a partnership, state and industry together. I know, on the independent adjuster side, New Mexico was able to get rid of their bond requirement. And I think that's a good example of kind of, New Mexico really kind of leveraged bringing that to the industry's attention on a lot of these national calls and conferences and saying, we need your feedback, any kind of help you can do to help get this passed. They reached out for kind of information on what the pain points are with that, to try to help in any way. That kind of, I think, is a sign of, working state and industry kind of working together to make, I don't want to say make this a better place, but to sound a little cheesy, but that's kind of a good example of it. It's and then the changes to continuing education. Oklahoma is removing that 1 hour of earthquake CE for the property line adjusters. And then, you have your pending changes. It's something that we keep an eye on, especially through the SALS committee. This is stuff that we do track, that you can see that there are, states are trying to make changes. So it's, New York is trying to add CE or waive the exam requirement. Like I said before, these two kind of get introduced in some capacity every year, but they don't gain traction. But it's, not for lack of effort, and you never know, this might be the year that it finally does get that push through. And then Texas is trying to amend their insurance code to include being able to submit via NIPR, which I know they are. I think we all were very excited when they finally moved to CERCON, that we didn't have to send in that 15-page application anymore. So, it's baby steps in the right direction over the course of the year, that, it's, adjuster licensing has always kind of been a little bit more interesting and fiery than the producer side, and it keeps things interesting, that's for sure. But it's it's just an ever-changing kind of space. And if, that's, I think, a good segue into, if you are a SILA member, the SILA adjuster licensing subgroup has 2 adjuster sessions at the national conference this October. If you want to be part of the conversation or just listen in, learn more about adjusters, you got some adjuster problem, you want to see what other people's opinions are on it. These are the 2 sessions that the SALS committee are going to be assisting in. Our first session is on Monday. It's the impact of regulations on adjuster licensing, where we'll kind of go over, some examples of license changes that have happened in the past, kind of what some best practices are to kind of prepare for that, navigate that just from the state and industry side. And then our adjuster forum is on Tuesday, which is more so kind of if you have a unique issue or something you want to kind of gain insight from regulators or industry, that's kind of your, it's like an open mic situation where you can ask it to kind of bring it to the floor and see how other people would handle it. And I know I'm going to be at the SILA conference. Rachel, are you going to be there? Do you know yet?
Yes,
I think it
ma'am.
might be still, yeah. So, if you want to come talk about adjusters with us, we'll both be there, and would love to hear from you, for sure.
So in that vein, I know we have 4 minutes. We have 4 minutes. There are a few things in the chat that I would love to address. My eyeballs have been like looking back and forth. And there's our final slide. So there's a few questions, a few things going on in the chat that I think are worth talking about in the last couple of minutes. There's a comment that says having tenured staff adjusters take an exam after holding a license for so long, and it's putting stress on the industry. I hear you. We are in Rhode Island dealing with this very delicately. I do not want to be faced with a situation where I've got a Massachusetts resident who doesn't they can't get a license, but has had a license and is at like the twilight end of their career. They've been servicing Rhode Island for 35 years. So, and I've also talked locally, like at AICP chapter meetings and et cetera. If those burdens are measurable, and I would suggest just personally, like reaching out to the regulators in that state with how many of these situations you have, how do we fix this? Is there a path of least, whatever. Those conversations, I think, just have to happen. And then, if they shoot you down, they shoot you down, right? Because at the end of the day, the regulators are making that decision. And then the other thing I wanted to address, and I don't know if Caitlin, if you picked out anything here you want to address. There's one of the first comments, I've had clients not know if they have a DHS, and when we pull the licenses, everything comes up as non-residents. Do the states have to disclose on the license if it is a DHS license, or does that vary from state to state? So we did kind of cover that a little bit, but I want to draw attention to it again. It's that 2-digit code on the PDB report in Rhode Island. If Rhode Island issues designated home state status, we're putting an RI in there. If Caitlin is that person and she's licensed in 15 other states and those other states have a bunch of other things in there, I don't know what that's about, but if we issued in Rhode Island, we issued it in Rhode Island. The only other variation is if the state issues a license type with the designated home state. So you should be able to have some confidence in whether the state that someone chose, if that state is actually reporting itself. So they are all going to be non-resident licenses if they have a DHS, because they don't have a resident state. They're looking for a designated home state. So I wanted to sort of make that clarification. And there's a whole bunch of comments in here about Arizona, which we'll probably have to address via email because we're down to 1 minute. So I will turn it over to Julie, who might want to close this meeting.
Well, Caitlin and Rachel, thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. This is a really complicated topic. So I mad respect for you people who have to deal with this every day. Everyone, please watch for our notice for the August webinar on common compliance pitfalls in surplus lines. And remember that our webinars are public and free of charge. Sharing your invitations is greatly appreciated. Watch for and complete the post-webinar survey. We'll see you next month and hopefully see you in October. Thank you.